Hi, just to let you guys know, we'll be live streaming this room. If possible, turn on your video camera. If not, it's fine.
All right, with that, we'll go into introductions. So my name is Timkeen. I'm going to be chairing this debate. I go by she, they pronouns. If the panel could now also introduce themselves.
My name is Hans. I go by he or they.
Dominic here, no preference.
Thank you. So if teams could briefly introduce themselves now, going from OG to CO. And after that, I will invite the Honorable Prime Minister to give a speech not exceeding 7 minutes in length.
Hi, this is the Prime Minister. I have no preference. My name is Wasif.
DPM, no preference, Sajid.
In opening opposition, Sharwin will go first, Danish will go second. Both of us have no gender preferences. Thank you.
Hi, from CG, Ira will be going as member, Kevin will be going as whip, and neither of us have any preferred pronouns.
From CO, Wafi will be going first, Shadab will be going second. Both of us prefer he or they.
Thank you. I now invite the very Honorable Prime Minister to give a speech not exceeding 7 minutes in length. Hear, hear.
Am I audible?
Yes.
Starting my speech. 3, 2, 1. We think the Muslim majority nations in Southeast Asia are some of the most inspiring and best growing nations across the world, with Indonesia, for example, being seen as the most growing economy within the Asian region. We think that their current mode of development through different forms of educational investment has been useful. We think Saudi investment in education is regressive for all of those values because it inherently promotes instability and separation within these countries. What do we support from opening government? We support other forms of educational investment that we already currently have, ones which do not focus on ideological grasps over the identities of individuals. So for example, we are okay with investments from more moderate and decentralized groups which incorporate larger number of countries like the OIC, where for instance, they have already funded institutions like the IIU in Malaysia or IUT in Bangladesh, where they do not impose a certain brand of restrictions. We're okay with Western investment in education, which is already prevalent in places like Malaysia, where we see institutions like Monash or other Canadian universities investing for different branches within these areas. The third thing we're okay with is investment in an overall educational scheme through the ASEAN. I think they're currently focusing on a diffusion of educational resources across the different countries. So stronger countries like Singapore can contribute to the development of the education in these areas. Why are we so against, and what do we think that Saudi investment actually entails? It entails things like setting up independent schools which are bereft from the centralized form of education that governments or the national fabric actually wants to endorse. This looks like setting up small schools like Qaumi madrasas in underdeveloped regions across Malaysia and Indonesia. In the broader scheme, it would promote things like through their schooling facilities, I think that they are primarily faulty because they often employ their own Islamic background-based faculties or styles of education. They use this to promote Wahhabism, which is problematic for 3 different reasons. The first of which is it often restricts the quality of education to a significant degree. For instance, where they do not believe in things like interest rates, where interest rates are disallowed in Islam, so the quality of business education would be heavily stifled, or where they do not believe in certain brands of philosophy or do not believe in education. It's a direct hindrance to the quality of education individuals are likely to get. But the second thing is, through Wahhabism, they want to promote a very strong version of conservatism, where they, for instance, promote things like intolerance towards LGBTQ individuals or restricting rights of certain females and the stand for equality, where, for instance, they would promote the enforcement of things like the burqa for individuals going to school in those particular institutions. But thirdly, it would be things like a stronger centralization of Islam. This is problematic because often this entails a higher degree of intolerance towards non-Muslims. We think these are the immediate kinds of ideological pushes that you'd be expecting from these schools, the point at which you're allowed to set up these schools. This is unlikely to change for 2 reasons through the Saudi government's investments. The first of which is they want to establish Wahhabism as a primary brand of Muslim across the world. The evidence of this would be them going into different proxy wars in different regions where the mode of Islamic power is often determined by other players. So they are constantly in clashes with Iran, who want to stand for a different version of this. So for political power is one of the reasons why they want this identity. But I think they're unlikely to be able to change this because, for instance, the current individuals in power, that is to say, MBS is someone who is purging parliament and centralizing their authority. This means that they're unlikely to change from other forces, which means that a strong version of Wahhabism will continue because ruling elites, the clerics that give them religious authority in the royal family, are the ones who want to establish Wahhabism, which means these kinds of changes are unlikely to be ever changing and are likely to be quite enforced within any education investment through Saudi Arabia. This is extremely problematic, and this is where I moved into the impact-based arguments from my speech. The first of which is that Southeast Asian Muslim countries are often extremely pluralistic. For example, in Indonesia, there are many different ethnicities and many different versions of Islam that is practiced by individuals. So centralization is immediately something that falls at the face of what the government and the people generally would like to practice within these countries. Likewise, Malaysia, for example, has moved on to a very modernized version of Islam. They practice Shafi Islam, where they have, for instance, things like a lot of investment in Islamic finance, where they have incorporated things which are otherwise unacceptable under Wahhabism. They have decentralized fatwas and have promoted rights of women. These are practices that have only been possible because of the current modes of investment that we support, and we think Saudi investment is directly antithetical to all of these things. This is because there is a direct instability that Saudi investment initially does put on individuals, because it tells them that these are individuals who are not being supported by their state. These are people who are being left and the practice of Islam that is given to them, which means they're able to rile up individuals to not allow for these practices to stand by. The comparative on the two sides, in instances where, for instance, there might be a lack of educational access, was parents would always want to send their children, when they're from Muslim majority countries, to Islamic institutions. The point at which the types of Islamic institutions are more moderate, are the only accessible educational institutions are the public schools. They would send their children to those schools, therefore reducing the scope for the instability created from the Saudi-based institutions on the opposition bench, which means that the scope for this pluralism surviving is extremely limited. This has three critical impacts. Before I move on to these, opening opposition, go for it.
Do nations have absolutely no control as to how the investment is utilized?
I would suggest that no. Primarily, they do set up independent institutions. In the instance that they would be, I'll move on to exactly why they allow some of this investment in the second idea. But like really quickly on impacts of this degree of instability. Firstly, I would suggest that this really reduces the scope for coexistence in these particular states, which means that you often pit the majority against minorities and create further degree of violence and instability between them. This is, for instance, evident in Malaysia, where the Malays, for instance, are relatively privileged, but they are made to often feel like there is something against them or they're not getting certain benefits, which is why they're often antagonistic towards the minorities. But second of all, this means a large-scale harm towards individuals who are currently being accepted, like gay Muslims or the liberalization of women. But lastly, this harms the political landscape within these areas because, to a large extent, this empowers certain separatist ideas in rural areas in particular. Why is this likely? Because we think that the way in which Wahhabism works is it often relies on individuals believing in a central authority, which is through their organized version of religion. The differences that they experience in their everyday livelihood from the central government or from the majority are often instances where you would breed separatism. But second of all, and this is where I directly engage with the POI as well, it is often lucrative for politicians to allow these kinds of investments in the short term because they believe it makes them look better, particularly in places where there are rural investments or places where there is some degree of development because they're allowing these kinds of investments. So they want to allow Saudi to invest in these places autonomously. The problem is, at the point where they do allow these kinds of investments, there is a creation of these separatist ideologies, which eventually leads to the erosion of certain democratic standards. This becomes worsened because in these countries in particular, we've already seen the overthrowing of corrupt governments and an increasing instance of trying to expand governance into minority regions. You regress all of that if you allow Saudi investment in these places. Very glad to propose.
I thank the speaker for their fine speech and now call upon the very honourable Leader of Opposition to give their speech not exceeding 7 minutes in length. Hear, hear.
Hello, am I audible? Okay.
Yes.
All right, thanks. We agree with the framing coming up from Prime Minister about the three countries that are involved, Malaysia, Indonesia, Brunei. But I think that this debate is more specifically, or the country that's most likely affected by this motion is Indonesia. This is because Brunei is a very rich country because of their oil money, and their Sultan gives out money like nobody's business, and they have like lots of billions of dollars already invested in the education sector. Malaysia, it is moving towards an upper middle income country, and we also don't have much of a problem in terms of education budgets. Our budgets have been increasing over the years. I don't think our education sector requires funding from Saudi. This debate is therefore about Indonesia, primarily because of their underfunded education system, and Indonesia having the lowest spending per capita in terms of education in the Southeast Asian region. So therefore, this debate is about Indonesia and about Indonesia getting Saudi funding in terms of social investment, because the context is Saudi allocated $1 billion in terms of their social investments to further the cause of instilling Islamic values, or steering Islamic countries towards a more moderate form of Islam that is more in line with Sunni Islam, as well as forming long-term trade ties with these Islamic countries, given the context of globally, Islamic economies are generally growing and are also forming together and becoming stronger, right? So I'm going to talk about two things in my speech. Firstly, why Indonesia needs that funding and is in no position to reject funding from Saudi Arabia. Secondly, why Islamization of Indonesia through the government system or through the lens of the government is better in comparison to what will happen in governments world where the Indonesian government rejects Saudi funding, right? But before that, I have 2 points of rebuttal. Firstly, on their point of because opening government's case focuses a lot about tertiary education and teaching things like Islamic banking and finance and Islamic economics. And like Islamic economics does not allow things like interest rates. So this philosophical difference is not necessarily a bad thing. Just because Islam practices a different form of economy does not mean that form of economy or economic philosophy is a bad thing. I think that it's in fact better than a lot of Western versions of economics, in which we have Islamic banking and finance prioritizing fundamental economic value versus speculation, and Islamic economies generally focus on economic stability over short-term fluctuations in the market, right? So this has largely been the reason why Islamic financial markets has reached 1 trillion valuation in the world, and the fact that Malaysia is now the biggest Islamic financial market in the world. Education, or Saudi investing in Islamic education in Indonesia, for example, will allow Indonesia to match this trend happening in Malaysia, or will match this trend of Islamic financial markets growing and grow the Islamic economy even more. I don't see why Islamic education is a bad thing, or rather Islamic learning in the economy through Islamic lens is a bad thing. Next, you talked about Wahhabism and how Saudi will steer or will incite Wahhabism in Indonesia or the Southeast Asian countries. Well, I don't think this is much of a problem because of Mohammed bin Salman having plans to sever the ties between the Saudi government and Wahhabi clerics. He has done things like liberalizing the economy, allowing women to drive, for example, allowing women to enter social events with other men, which is in contrast with a lot of Wahhabi clerics. Secondly, he's limiting the power of clerics over state affairs in Saudi as well, right? So conclusion, Mohammed bin Salman is heading the government, the Saudi government, and Saudi aid will most likely be influenced by Mohammed bin Salman, which means that he's less likely to push for Wahhabi values in Indonesia and is more likely to push for more moderate Islamic values in the first place. Why is Saudi Arabia the primary source of funding, and why would Saudi Arabia want to do this? Because most countries or other countries don't have money to invest in education, primarily because FDI returns are lower than in other sectors like tech, for example. But the thing is, Saudi Arabia is not there for FDI returns or interest rate returns, for example. They are there for a more social cause. The social cause is to steer nations to practice more Islamic values, firstly, and secondly, to build long-term trade relationships with other Islamic economies to make the OIC, or the Organization of Islamic Countries, even stronger, to strengthen the Islamic economy so that the Islamic financial market will become stronger. And given the fact that a lot of Islamic countries also have oil money, right? So they want to build a trade relationship, make it stronger as a bloc, right? The thing is, OG's examples only revolve around tertiary education, but they do not talk about the huge deficiency in the primary and secondary school system in Indonesia, right? So the model that we fight for is Indonesia accepting Saudi education aid, because Saudi will invest in your education sector anyway. If they don't invest through a government, they will do it through a to private schools, for example. For example, Islamic international schools in Malaysia and Indonesia, in which government has no control over the syllabus. All their harms about Wahhabism, extremism, and Islamic values will exist even worse if the government does not intervene and moderate the negotiations that happen between Saudi investors and these schools. We support government control in negotiations revolving the formation of syllabus. In our world is where it is more likely for you to form a middle ground between Saudi investors and Islamic fundamentalism. Why do many schools in Indonesia need funding? They are primarily a public schooling system, have low infrastructure, have low quality teaching because of a lack of funding means there's a very high student to teacher ratio, and it reduces the availability of funds to train teachers to recruit and subjects as well, right? They also have the worst spending per capita, and given the fact that Indonesia has 50 million students, the fourth largest schooling system in the world, and only 3 million teachers, they have a very high teacher to student ratio and also very low infrastructure, right? So we say that when Indonesia is not in a position to not accept or to reject Saudi funding because they need to fund their public schooling system and improve their infrastructure and to do things like teacher training, for example, right? So this is when you get to invest in teacher training and increase or sort of lower the ratio between teachers and students, and have more money to train teachers and fund the madrasas anyway, right? Secondly, why is Islamization of education in Indonesia not a bad thing? Primarily because Indonesia is the country with the most number of Muslims in the world. 88% of Indonesians are Muslim. Secondly, they are Sunni Muslims, which aligns with the values of Saudi Arabia. And thirdly, 30% of students in Indonesia attend Islamic schools. They have 35,000 madrasas that can benefit from this funding, right? And we say that secondly, religious teachings will not overwhelm or eclipse the whole education system. They're only a subset of education. They're only one subject, but the other subjects like science and maths will still be taught as it's taught everywhere. It's more universal. There's no Islamic maths, for example, or Islamic science, right? So we say that there's not that much of a problem. But thirdly, and most importantly, private funding is worse, right? This is because all of the harms about Wahhabism and extremist values being pushed by side government will happen even worse if government-approved investment does not happen. In our world, when we go through government lens, when you go through government negotiations, this is better because then the government can check for extremist values. Conversely, Saudi can still invest in their world, but by building things like private schools that are not vetted by the government. These places become even greater melting pots or greater holes where extremist values can be festered even more. In our world, government funding has better control over negotiations, and on top of that, we get to solve the funding problem and the infrastructural problem that is existent within the primary and secondary schools in Indonesia. Very proud to oppose.
I thank the speaker for their fine speech and now invite the very Honourable Deputy Prime Minister to give their speech not exceeding 7 minutes in length. Hear, hear.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Just give me 1 sec. Starting in 3, 2, 1. I'm a Muslim too, but even I don't believe in the lies that opening opposition tells you about Saudi Arabia. First, this debate is not just about Indonesia. 3 reasons why. Number 1, Saudi Arabia invests in madrasas in Singapore, arguably the richest country in Southeast Asia. Yes, it's not a part of this debate, but it just goes on to show to you that O's logic of countries don't want to accept funding because they're rich anyway is stupid, because Singapore can have more education for their minorities and see that as a political win. Number 2, Malaysia has poor groups and poor regions as well. It's not like Malaysia is the richest country in the world where, regions like Sarawak have like the best quality of education where everyone is really happy. Number 3, even if they're just going to debate in that context, all our arguments that Wasit presented to you apply to Indonesia as well. So it's not like any of this is mutually exclusive. Then they go on to some really funny stuff. Guys, MBS is really great. He's liberal. Number 1, let's take the best case scenario of that, even though it is probably not true. Their logic is, literally, this is the logic. He legalized driving for women. He empowered women. Yes, in a different context where he didn't kill Jamal Khashoggi and wasn't being antagonized by literally the whole world. So for him to hold on to power now, he needs the support of the religious elite clerics with money who tend to be more Wahhabi. So even by their logic, if it is based on trends suggest that he's going to become more Wahhabi. Number two, even if he was liberal, that is something that is a political sell internally. What he wants as an incentive within these regions is to establish Saudi Arabia as a supreme political power in the Islamic world. For that, he needs to stop the rise of Malaysia and the rise of Indonesia by their versions of Islam. So to be antithetical to Malaysia and Indonesia, he needs to be antithetical to the values that they stand for. So he can't just be Shafi and get away with it. He has to be Wahhabi because he wants to create instability within these regions and wants to fracture these regions. So the logic by which they say that these places are going to get liberal education or liberal versions of Islam from MBS is just a lie. Then they say, oh, but we want the government to regulate Saudi Arabia. Funny logic, because the other part of their case is these governments are super desperate and really, really want the money. So if they're desperate, how exactly are they going to add negotiating power and add more clauses to where this financing is going to be used? Presumably that would also reduce the ability to get the amount of financing that they get. So either you tell me these governments are powerful and not desperate, in which case all our arguments of increasing other forms of education apply, or they're super desperate and therefore they cannot regulate this education and MBS gets to do whatever he wants. Both of those scenarios are scenarios that we've considered. They're contradicting their case if they argue based on that. Two things I'll add. Number one, let's say some regions don't get education. We think this education from Saudi Arabia is a net negative, and we'd much rather have slower infiltration of education from other sources, even if it means these regions don't get education in the short run. We presume that this is the biggest trade-off that even closing opposition will run. We'll just say that it's a worthy trade-off. Three structural reasons why. Number one, you need to recognize that most of these rural communities are not by definition Muslim majorities. This is because presumably if a country is Muslim majority, the political capture within that country is going to come from the Muslim majority. So the regions and the communities that are most likely to be left behind are the ones that are not Muslim. So if you look at the areas that we're talking about, this looks like West Java in Indonesia, which have a significant proportion of Hindu people, Buddhist people as well. What this means is the Saudi government often wants to enter untapped areas. We've seen this all across South Asia, where they look into rural areas in Bangladesh, rural areas of Pakistan, even though these are Muslim majority countries. The same strategy is going to be used in order to expand their power. Why is this strategy the strategy they take? Number one, for the very reasons O talks about, the urban area is concentrated. Number two, these areas are easier to convert and proselytize in. So the first reason why this education is a net negative, a lot of existential Hindu communities, Buddhist communities get forced proselytization. This applies more to primary education as opening talks about, because the madrasas are more likely to influence them into getting into this education. That's where Wasif's trade-off argument of parents' decisions come in. If you're a Hindu person, you presumably still want your child to get education. This is why a lot of, even in the most, liberal spheres, a lot of Hindus try to get into IUM for the quality of the education itself. Imagine how much the scale of the harm is in a rural community with no alternatives. So number one, forced proselytization, indoctrination. I think that's a pretty big harm because it takes away your autonomy, all the stuff that white debaters say that I don't want to get into. Number two, the nature of education itself is going to be counterproductive. First, because the quality of education is going to be things that are antithetical to what you want to develop towards. So even if there's Islamic financing, there are different versions of it. One version of it doesn't allow interest rates at all because it's seen as haram to take profits without putting any form of investment within it. So what this means is you're likely to have a devolution from the kinds of overall economic structure that you want to incorporate these rural communities into, and try to envision a different form of economy within those rural areas. Number two, the education is going to be provided by self-employed imams and clerics that can rhetoricize the degree of importance of lack of interest, even though in reality it doesn't matter much for any moderate Muslim like me. Third, these schools are likely to be antithetical to your national identity. Most of these Southeast Asian regions have developed because they've promoted a national identity of being Malaysian, being a part of a greater good for Indonesia. What this has looked like is looking at common enemies that attack all groups. So this could be Najib Razak, who is like corrupt and takes money away from all Malaysians. What this shifts towards is an individual Muslim identity that promotes your identity as being more important than the national identity, which a centralized version of Islam is likely to do. So the subtle shift from a hijab to a niqab is likely to empower thoughts of what your identity as a nation is to a far greater extent. So the trade-off is now, on the last scale, when these groups of communities start getting power and concentrated to Saudi Arabia, NGOs are less likely to be able to operate unless they're Muslim too. Schools from other investments are less likely to enter. The impact of this is very simple. On an extreme scale, you create outright separatist movements. This looks like the thought process of West Papua that wants to separate from Indonesia anyway, spreading to other regions of West Java, because they believe that their version of Islam, which wants a caliphate, which wants less democracy, but more centralization of their privilege, and the fact that they deserve it based on the rhetoric sold to them, is one that this government doesn't get. So they slowly change their cultural indoctrinations and perceptions towards one that wants to separate. This not only breaks the region, it fractures Muslim communities themselves too. So a majority that currently collectivizes is fractured into a Wahhabi majority, a Shafi majority. This is something that we cannot allow in a democratizing Southeast Asia, even in Muslim regions. We just think this ruins the entire process. I don't care if we delay education. Very glad to propose.
I thank the speaker for their very fine speech and now invite the Deputy Leader of Opposition to give their speech, not exceeding 7 minutes in length. Here.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes, there's just a slight echo.
Is it gone now?
Yeah.
Okay, my partner's laptop. Firstly, there are 3 Muslim majority nations in Southeast Asia: Brunei, Malaysia, and Indonesia. Secondly, this doesn't include Singapore, by the way, so they are completely out of the debate. Secondly, if all the harms on opening government is about how Saudi will use the desperation of these nations to incline these education systems towards Wahhabism and radical Islam, Brunei and Malaysia cannot be part of this debate because they are self-sufficient. They will never bend to Saudi's will to have a more radical Islam madrasas in their nation. That is why no investment is currently ongoing to both of these countries. That is why a large majority of this debate is happening specifically in Indonesia. And that is why the baseline in where this debate operates is on which side you can best provide educational opportunities to Indonesia. Before I go into detailed responses, I think it's also important to recognize that OG or government bench cannot claim that they are decent alternatives on their side, because the examples that they provide to you, Monash, for example, is a private institution that is based on getting return of investment from degree students. But that isn't the problem that is currently plaguing Indonesia. Like Sharwin told you, the basic educational infrastructures are not fundamental enough in Indonesia where investment can go into tertiary educations. It is more likened towards how you can build the fundamental infrastructures to create an educated population, especially in the rural areas. And this is only happening through investments where there's Islamic philosophy involved. Because like what Sharwin told you, FDI will never come from any other alternatives. And secondly, they tell you you can wait for alternatives to come from the OIC, and whether it's sufficient or not, they don't tell you. But even worse, that while waiting for these sufficient alternatives, you are leaving these individuals destitute from education because of the precarious risks of separatist movements and whatnot. Now, let's talk about whether Saudi Arabia is leaning towards a more moderate Islam, because that is a contentious clash that opening government believes is not true. And they give you examples, like they tell you that he has killed Jamal Khashoggi and he needs the close relationship with the clerics. We think that is not the only strategy for this person to stay in power, because like we told you, he has made a decision to empower individuals within his country, even though at the contention of clerics, by i.e. empowering women, and B, detaching clerics' power from politics. So even if the clerics are angry at him, there are no impacts towards him because they are detached from the ability to make important decisions of that country. This is why he is creating investments in social aid in Muslim majority countries that require it, so that they are bargaining blocks in him to sustain his power as a Muslim leader of this country. And that is why it is likely that all of these investments are going to be one that is geared towards helping these nations and providing economic equality. But even if in the worst case it's about Wahhabism and radicalism, we still take the debate because we prioritize educational opportunities for these individuals more so than we prioritize the limited potential risks of separatist movements, because that's the biggest impact that they can provide. Now, let's talk about the desperation of Indonesia, because another thing they tell you is that if Indonesia is so desperate, they won't be able to control any negotiation when it comes to how these education facilities is taught. This is not true, because no matter what country you live in, there is always a limit as to how much push you're willing to take. The best instances, if the risk of separatist movements and political divide is true and obvious, like what opening government posits, it is unlikely that it is worth the investment anyway. We think it is. That's the first reason. But the second reason, it is logistically impossible to have complete control over an educational system that is not your country, because Saudi cannot afford to fly 6 to 7 million teachers that have been schooled in radical Wahhabism to come to primary school and teach them one by one that interest rates are not good. I think it is extremely difficult to do that. It is more likely that people who have grown up in these communities are going to take what they have from Saudi Arabia and then teach the syllabus. A. B, it is very difficult to integrate national syllabus with pure Islamic Wahhabism to a point where it can create all these negative impacts that opening government is talking about. Because no matter what, there is still a vision. There's still a vision of what national education looks like in Indonesia. I don't think Saudi Arabia or any country can dictate as to completely changing and reforming the education system with a $1 billion aid. I think that's a bit of a stretch from opening government, which is a lot of the arguments in today's debate. Next, let's talk about, because of this pluralistic community, a lot of rural areas will be forced to proselytize in their countries, in these places. First response is that a majority of rural areas are not concerning those who are non-Muslim, because a majority of those who are non-Muslim in Indonesia are children of migrants who live in states, in city capitals, because that is where job opportunities were the most. And that is why the most pluralistic of communities happen in central cities. So the first link as to how rural communities will be forced to proselytize is not there. But secondly, even if there are individuals who are forced to proselytize, I don't think proselytization happens in schools. It's not the teachers coming in, you have to be Muslim or you can't study here. I think it's likely, even in countries like Malaysia, where non-Muslims occur in rural areas, where even if Islam is a majority religion and country want to proselytize, they still have to provide an option to non-Muslims to either take that subject or not. And it is very common that these people don't take that bet. But thirdly and lastly, even if few individuals in rural communities are forced to proselytize, it is not worth the takeoff of providing educational facilities to literally every student in Indonesia that requires it to build and elevate themselves, because that is a bigger priority in comparison to people having to do things that they're uncomfortable with when you're a minority. That's literally the biggest problem. That's literally a problem that persists in every democracy. It has existed in Indonesia. Now it is unlikely to go away just because Saudi has investment. And finally, separatist movements. I think the biggest problem with opening government is that they speak heavily about how these people can grope into fundamentals and then create divisions and then militarily threaten Indonesia. This is just by attending a school. Even Saudi Arabia is not that crazy. Even there, they don't prosecute non-Muslims to a point of where it creates separatist movements. Why is it likely that it's going to happen to Indonesia, given the fact that they are already a strong community where everyone has to have a Muslim name anyway, where most communities are integrated with one another despite being pluralistic? In recognition of all of these contexts, we think it is unlikely that a separatist movement will happen. What did opening opposition give to you in this debate? We first told you the difficulty in Indonesia getting educational investment. Second, we told you why they are desperate. Thirdly, we told you why Saudi's investment won't be as bad. Fourthly, we told you why even if it is bad, it won't create the same potential that it's creating. And in worst case, even if radicalism becomes a problem, we don't think depriving individuals of schools, infrastructure, and student welfare is worth the takeoff. Very proud to oppose.
I thank the speaker for their fine speech. And now invite the member of government to give a speech not exceeding 7 minutes in length. Hear, hear.
Am I audible?
Yes.
Okay, just give me a second. Just going to set up my timer. Okay. Starting in 3, 2, 1. The reason why opening government isn't good enough to opening opposition's claim is because they don't give any mechanization on how this radicalization really works in schools and universities, which is why opening opposition continuously keeps questioning them on as to where is this really going to work, and they have a counter claim as to how it's good for like these universities and things like that. We're going to fill in that void, and we're going to tell you exactly the exact mechanism on how this radicalization really works. And secondly, we're also going to tell you how it's worse off for a country like Indonesia on an international spectrum and why it's bad for its image, right? But quickly first on this mechanization. Look, we think that we're going to engage with like opening oppositions and this debate being in Indonesia, we're fine with it. And I'm going to prove to you why it's bad in Indonesia, especially, right? In Indonesia, the kind of influence that is exerted through like universities and things like that goes so deep that there's literally like mobs and rallying point which is created like along radical Islam, right? Which means that radical Islam becomes a unifying theme and a center of mobilization to the point at which you literally have student wing political parties who are going ahead and campaigning and advocating for these things in the universities and colleges and things like that, right? A couple of years ago, the Saudi government literally took over and supported and gave donations and things like that to an Islamist majority party in Indonesia, which in turn went ahead and supported some elite students who were literally groomed for political and religious leadership and who were to like go ahead and become the government later on, right? Thirdly, literally like all of the good most elite students are taken to Riyadh to study, and those who stay back from these colleges and institutions are made ambassadors of this kind of extremist form of Wahhabism. We think that's the way how these colleges and universities function, and that's the reason as to why they're literally made into student wings of these political parties, and that's how they go ahead and exert their influence, right? These are the students who go and continuously protest and rally against all of these liberal policies that any kind of good government or new government wants to bring forth, and they're the ones who go ahead, who are like literally the youth of the country and have no incentive to go ahead and support these liberal policies that there should be. This in turn is bad for those poor students that opening opposition keeps talking about, simply because the kind of influence that is exerted ensures that these political parties don't give things like voting rights if like poor people etc don't vote for the most Islamist like majority party there, right? Once they come into power, they will go ahead and change curriculums of schools and things like that, right? So we think that even on that front, if they had to like go ahead and talk about poor people, we think those are worse off on their side of the house. We think Saudi investment is extremely problematic because the way they function is that they go ahead and indoctrinate in students the idea that the kingdom in Saudi is the best, like it's some kind of like glorified a harbinger of like equality and things like that, and that's the only thing you should be supporting. That's the extent to which they're indoctrinated with these kind of beliefs, and the way and the continuous incentives that they provide to like college students and things like that are the ones which lead to these radical factions of Islam festering and growing more powerful in nature, right? And here's the second problem with Wahhabism. Wahhabism is directly opposed to what Islam actually stands for, right? Which means it seeks to erode Islam from the very base and leads to a loss of culture in and of itself. Which means this entire country, if we were to take Indonesia, becomes the face of this kind of extreme or like radical form of Islam, and we think that's problematic because it's literally losing their culture, and that becomes their identity. We think it's problematic. An example would be like in Jakarta. a very conservative leader was elected into power simply because this was the kind of indoctrination among like the students and like youth voters and things like that. At the same time, there was also another candidate running around on liberal lines. That's the extent of which, you know, these people have been like indoctrinated to like vote for like majority parties and things like that. But secondly, on as to how this is bad for the international relations of any Southeast Asian country for that matter, right? Because the idea is this: once you have this kind of Islam that's growing in that country, you're going to have more tensions between them and other countries of Asia, like Myanmar, Singapore, and Philippines, where there are Muslim minorities, right? And these Muslim minorities in those countries have been continuously advocating for a more moderate form of Islam, where they're gone ahead and like advocated for like Islam, which is like more inclusive in nature and things like that, right? We think you stand at the risk of upsetting these countries and upsetting like Asia in and of itself as a whole, because now you don't have much of a standing to like go ahead and trade with them. Because these other countries have to protect the interests of their own people, there's a high chance that Indonesia is going to lose its standing in the international forum or lose its standing in Asia in and of itself, because it becomes the face of these kind of radical political parties and nobody wants to like go and trade with them, right? Other countries who have had like a more liberal who have had like a more liberal uprising in like recent times, and we think there are a lot of Southeast Asian countries do so, don't have an incentive to go ahead and maintain ties with like countries like this, because it's like problematic in and of themselves, right? But quickly on, this is something that OG never touches upon, what are the alternatives and why do we think they're better off, right? We think that the moment you have like international significance that you're retaining as a country in and of itself, we think it's good for you, right? Because nobody wants to go ahead and trade with a country which is so radical in nature, right? But secondly, we also think that the point at which you're part of ASEAN and ASEAN starts trading as a bloc, we think that you can attract trade or like attract investments from a number of other countries.
Saudi is a conservative Muslim country, yet is the biggest trader of oil and natural gas.
Okay, that's because people don't have a choice but to like go ahead and like trade with them, right? Like there are very finite resources of oil in these countries, and like you don't really know what to do about it. Like Saudi Arabia in and of itself is an extremely like rich country, right? I don't know how a much poorer country like Indonesia probably doesn't have enough of like natural resources like Saudi Arabia is ever going to have the same kind of international standing. I don't really know how you can equate the two countries, right? But we also think that once you have ASEAN, which has unity and people don't like ostracize Indonesia, we think it can go ahead and attract investments from countries like the US, who also have a united front against China, right? Which means there's a higher likelihood that probably the US is probably like come and trade with you when you have a unified bloc in and of itself. But we also think lastly that once you trade as a bloc, that is once ASEAN as a bloc goes ahead and starts trading with other countries, there are going to be other countries who are going to be much more comfortable trading with you, who will be comfortable taking that risk, because it's a high likelihood that the risk isn't going to go to waste, right? Which means that at the end of the day, you will have alternative sources of revenue, a better chance of alternative source of revenue when you ensure that you're in good terms with other countries of the ASEAN, when you ensure that they're all going to be ready to trade with you and form a bloc with you. The point at which you like shoo them away or don't have an incentive to let them like trade with you, we think that's problematic for the country in and of itself. Extremely proud to propose.
I thank the speaker for their fine speech and now invite the Honourable Member of Opposition to give their speech not exceeding 7 minutes in length. Hear, hear.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes.
All right, just give me a second. Starting in 3, 2, 1. I think it's important to note at this point in time that all of the material that comes from opening government is largely patronizing in nature. They talk about like why Wahhabism is bad or why all of these are antithetical to national identity, without at any point in time mentioning why these are the most important aspects for these Southeast Asian nations to consider right now, given the current context that's going on. So for all of their materials to be true, they needed to show you why it is like cutting down on Wahhabism is the most important factor in the priority list of these Southeast Asian nations, or like not allowing this, like having the liberty or the privilege to choose which branding of education comes in, is a privilege that these Southeast Asian nations have. Given that they haven't done so, I think GovBench to a large extent has already been at a disadvantage within this debate. 4 points of context to properly understand where this debate is happening. The first thing I want you to note is that there are a large part of Southeast Asian nations right now are uneducated, which means these countries right now are going through a lot of crisis right now because of the fact that COVID has hit them bad, or because like a lot of economic crisis has been happening within these nations, which means right now the most important thing for these nations is to get education, some form of it within. The branding of education that comes in is secondary. That's the first thing that you need to know. The second thing is that there's a broad unemployment that's happening within these regions. There are two structural reasons because of this. The first is because of the COVID crisis that has been happening. The second is because of falling ties within China that has happened as a result of the Uyghur oppression, or because there's an internal backlash that these governments face because of their ties with China, or because a lot of these internal population don't want to go to China or don't want to go to other places of Southeast Asia for jobs, which means they'd rather stay back within these nations like Malaysia, Indonesia, and Brunei and become unemployed and rely on government funding like unemployed benefits, etc., which means the burden for governments increase. The third thing is contrary to what all the other sides are saying, the context of Islamic backsliding that they say will happen once Saudi Arabia comes in is something that's already happening. And there are a few reasons for this. Because first is because already there's a large-scale fear among these individuals that the same thing that happened within China might happen if our nation becomes increasingly more progressive or increasingly like other nations, which means their Muslim identity is directly at threat. They prioritize this because I think the fact that a lot of these oppressions have happened within other nations of Southeast Asia gives them the internal fear that this is something that we can't let go, because the corresponding future is something that will likely oppress us, or because we will lose a large part of this. The fourth thing, and this is extremely important, contrary to what everyone else believes, Saudi Arabia has a lot of interest within this region, which means that the power asymmetry that GovBench talks about and concedes to a certain extent isn't as exaggerated as they say. There are structural reasons for this, which I'll explain later on. But a few things to note. I think closing government is largely derivative in nature from opening government, but the only thing that they add is trade will fall, because guess what? No one wants to be associated with a radical nation. That's untrue. Saudi Arabia literally has very strong ties with the United States of America because of the fact that Donald Trump actively backs MBS and a lot of these things, or because they trade in oil or they trade in arms, which means a lot of these things happen in joint cooperation, or because of mutual enemies like China or Iran, which means that they will always have stronger ties. So the point in time that you do have trade relations with Saudi Arabia, that also opens door for you to have trade relations with other parts of the Western world, like the USA or other parts of Europe. But moving on, so all the other engagements will be integrated. So the first thing is, why do Southeast Asian nations need Saudi Arabia at this point in time? The first is because they have a shortage of funds. A lot of these people don't get educated. A lot of their fiscal budget is going in to try and carve down the pandemic right now, which means there's also a rise of right-wing rhetoric forcing these people to do things like ignore the lockdown or become more and more religious. This is happening, and this is evidenced by the fact that a lot of immigration deportation is happening within Malaysia, because a lot of individuals are saying that kick the people from Bangladesh out, the Bangladeshi immigrants who are taking our jobs away. All of this means that the infightings that are happening is significantly getting worse, and with your point in time. Why is this the most important context, and why does COVID have to be an important role? Because first, recognize that the impacts of COVID aren't going to go away anytime soon, which means for a large point in time, the fiscal deficits that these governments are having will curtail the amount of funds that they can fund on education. So Wasif tells you it will come from all other sources, and we're willing to take funds from other more moderate nations. But these moderate nations have zero incentive to invest in places like Malaysia, Indonesia, or Brunei, because first, they don't have enough funds because all of the nations are screwed over by COVID. But second, because a lot of these nations don't have corresponding mutual interests, which means a lot of these nations will not invest, which means under Gov's world, your shortage in terms of education will remain, and a large part of your population will not get education. What is the problem of this? The problem is, number one, that a lot of your future workforce isn't getting educated, which means to a large extent, these will be restricted within manual labor, or these will be restricted within individuals who will move away to other parts of the nation to get better education, other parts of the world to get better education. But second is that a lot of these people will remain unemployed, increasing the burden on these governments. So the most urgent issue is to increase the amount of individuals going to school, and you can do that only if you get Saudi investment. They say Wahhabism is bad, but at this point in time, time, you're not in a position to say or like choose which branding of education you want, because your like ability to provide education is curtailed. But why are we willing to take this trade-off? Because first, I think the Islamic backsliding happens far worse. We'll posit about the Afghani model that happened. In case of state failures, these Islamic pseudo groups are far more likely to like coerce these rural individuals, and these rural individuals who don't have access to jobs who don't have access to education are more likely to get proselytized in their side of the world anyways, because these people will trade off their identity for survival. So it is far more likely that the Islamic backsliding happens far, far worse under their side of the house. We are more okay with there being a monitored attempt at universities where government can have some degree of bargaining chip. So your ability to curtail Wahhabism or curtail the radicalization that happens is far better when it doesn't happen in like backdoor funding through Saudi Arabia, but it happens through a systematic manner that you can actually control. But secondly, understand why this is better, because this opens a large market of labor inflow with Saudi Arabia, which opens a lot of market within the Gulf region, which allows a lot of remittance flow into the country, which is important because a lot of these people don't want to go into China because they fear for their lives, or they fear that they will be oppressed and whatnot. So all of these people would rather remain unemployed. That is a comparative. But in our side of the house, they do actually have jobs, and this is beneficial for the Southeast Asian nations. Lastly, why do you have a bargaining chip? Because first, I think Saudi Arabia right now needs a lot of diversification within their economy. With falling oil prices, they require these nations to actively come in, which means you have a lot of ability to like determine the extent of radicalization you're willing to let in. But even if the absolute worst case is Wahhabism, recognize that it is within the state's interest right now to allow some form of education, to allow some form of employment to come in, because all of these problems are long-term. Because one, this pandemic isn't going away anytime soon, but two, the effects of the pandemic are likely to resolve into things that are going to lead to far more infighting for the government, all of which are problems that the government needs to solve. Extremely proud to oppose.
I thank the speaker for their fine speech and now call upon the very honourable government whip to deliver a speech not exceeding 7 minutes in length. Hear, hear.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes.
Cool, I'll just start in 10 seconds. Starting in 3, 2, 1. I'll first deal with closing opposition and tell you why they are completely out of the debate, and then I'll move on to the comparatives and why their world is better off in toto as an opposition. A large part of their case is largely mitigated. They're trying to say, oh, you know what, all these radicalism was anyway there and stuff like that. But notice that Saudi investment in education has been going on for quite some time, for the past 3-4 years, which means a lot of the radicalism that they're trying to mitigate has been actively festered and contributed to by the Saudi education. Ira gave you examples in terms of how in states like Jakarta, the active increase in violence and increase in protests and increase in radicalism carried out by student unions and student youth have been created and festered purely because of the kind of education and the kind of views that these universities promotes. We think all of these significantly contribute towards an instability and will also be detrimental towards the economic impact and growth that all these countries can have within themselves constantly because of all this, all these social divide and fester and disharmony that is created. And I'll take op at their best and say why economics are also worse off on their side. And that's why the first stand in terms of how, oh, these are bad anyway doesn't really stand, and that's not really true and misses the context. The second claim that they raise is, why is it relevant? Why should we prioritize stuff like minority and harmony? But notice a large part of Ira's speech is not just limiting to what OG said in terms of how it's bad for minorities, but a lot more implications in terms of, firstly, the democratic model of functioning. We think Saudi education actively promotes in political science and stuff like that in those courses to actively support autocratic rules of governance, which means they actively shut down dissent, and this sort of education is actively imparted towards educational and towards the youth in these countries, which means actively these youth are being taught to not prioritize democratic functions, to deprioritize dissent, to shut down upon dissent, and to oppose dissent. We think all these crucially will play way towards a great amount of economic and political instability. Look at countries like Malaysia, where there is not a single majority in power because there's a lot of instability present. In all of this instability, when you also bring in the factor of how countries and people and the youth become start shunning dissent, the amount of instability and political incoherence that is created in a lot of these countries is detrimentally going to impact the way in which countries can function economically as well. Because understand the time of COVID, when anyway a lot of these governmental resources are strained, you'll be far more strained in times of either trying to mitigate a lot of the disharmony or protests that might happen, or also in terms of trying to create coalition because there's so much dissent and so much widespread disharmony between the people. When there's no potential of unity created, we think a lot of amount of the economic policy that you could have been passed in status quo will not be passed inside opposition world because of all this disharmony that is created in terms of the education, in terms of the actions that are encouraged. We think they really tries and downplays the impact that a lot of these policies are. They actively go and tell you to take arms, to actively tell you to promote conservative Islam and try and shun minorities and try and convert them forcibly. A lot of this is going to foster a lot of instability. The second thing is in terms of how your isolation from ASEAN is going to leave you as a vulnerable actor in the country. We think in times of COVID, it's crucially important that you stay and maintain your ties with ASEAN, because if you're not a part of ASEAN, other countries are less willing to trade with you. We don't think Saudi alone can actually sustain you to growth in the long term. We think in the long term, you need to have a lot of different allies, and allies such as USA, Europe, and stuff that will only invest in you if they have the confidence that you are trading as a bloc. Because as a bloc, the losses can be offset. As a bloc, the amount of expertise that you have can also be shared between richer countries like Singapore and the other relatively poor countries. We think when you're trading as a bloc, the amount of economic growth and sustenance you can have on the long term is far more safer without any of the strings attached that come with the investments that come from Saudi. I think that's still better off on the comparative, even in our worst case. The next thing that they say in terms of how education, the strongest premise that they try to push is that, you know what, education results in economic growth. But understand this, and that's why Ira's speech is crucially important from government. It tells you how the kind of education that is promoted is not really normal education. They actively prioritize stuff like Wahhabism, actively prioritize stuff like you taking arms, which means they fester two kinds of things. Firstly, they fester a political divide between the people within those countries by creating an us versus them divide, which means the kind of people who come into power or actually are supported to come into power are likely going to be those who will want to take away minority rights, will go ahead and actively suppress the minority rights in terms of voting, which means the poorest of the poor in these countries will be worse off on their side when you're festering and supporting the economic policies and the entire thought process of the country which supports the active disenfranchisement of minorities and the poorest of the poor. We think they are worse off on their side, even on a comparative. The second thing that it promotes in terms of how a general disharmony. There's going to be a large amount of chaos in these countries when you're supporting the Saudi education, because the way in which Saudi education functions is that they do a host of things, right? Not only do this in terms of what Ira said in terms of how they support certain student unions that are more radical and they groom students for political roles, they also selectively support certain and prioritize certain Wahhabist radical campaigns on these campuses, just like China does in Australia. They prioritize certain thought processes, they prioritize certain actions, and they influence and they wield a significant amount of international power and influence to ensure that only certain radical things are allowed and festering thought process in the education, which means a lot of these festers in immense sort of animosity and disgruntlement between the two minorities. This sort of constant chaos is going to hamper the amount of economic growth you can have, because it hampers the functioning of factories and economic production houses. It also factors the way in which political diaspora is voted into power or stays in power. It also hampers and causes a great amount of protest and that, which is definitely going to slow down the rate at which economic growth can happen in ops world. We think that's a far worse of trade-off, and they had to defend that. Next, in terms of anti-democratic things, we think you also discourage liberalism in economic policies, and this is something that OJ really touched upon. In terms of the idea, the way in which you promote economic policies, Wahhabism is actively against a lot of these economic liberal policies and engagement with Western nations, because they actually shut down upon the Western thought process, ideologies, and religions. We think a lot of these economic travesties will happen in their world when you are actively taught to look down upon Western nations, look down upon Western allies, and look down upon these sort of economic policies that are more about liberalization. In general, when liberalization is shut down upon, the economic emancipation that the country can have is severely limited. We think that can be changed on our side when you're either limited and you're trading more with ASEAN. Notice how Malaysia and Singapore have in ASEAN in of itself, because they support. Every year there are more like, I think, $500 billion that come from Malaysia, either through a way of export and through a way of buying water from Malaysia and stuff like that. We think all these are crucial in endowment that come from ASEAN nations and can help in having the economic growth that that CEO and both opening up and closing up keep trying to harp on about as to, oh, we need economic growth. The economic growth is better off when you have a country when you aren't really dependent upon one country that is trying to turn you into a conservative realm and is trying to isolate you, but also in terms of how in our world there's a greater likelihood of liberalism coming about, and that is still better off. If I want, I'll take one from opening opposition.
Why are all of these things more important than providing acceptable education for 50 million Indonesian children?
See, that's the thing. You can't keep harking about how we need education when the education is going to be bad for the minorities, when the education is going to create a worse of economic political diaspora for the country in of itself, when it discourages dissent, when it discourages the actual proper elections, when it creates such a divide, an inherent divide in a pluralistic country is festered because of the education. We don't think an education in of itself can stand as a point for opening opposition to take over us, right? What then do we do in terms of what has closing government provided to you? We think firstly we tell you the amount of implication that this has. It also has implications in the political diaspora, because they're literally influencing the kind of leaders that you have tomorrow. tomorrow by in terms of encouraging what you say a scholarship, in terms of encouraging these people and grooming them for political space, which means Saudi wants to have an active influence in terms of the political policy that are passed. That means they're going to shut down on dissent, they're going to shut down on economic liberalization, which means they are bad for economically as well. A lot of opening opposition and closing opposition claims are beyond economy. But if the economy is worse or because of this move, we think they're going to take this debate comfortably. Why are we still then better than opening government? We think we had few crucial points of extensions that literally drive for the debate. First, in terms of the mechanism, because OG said by the virtue of Saudi coming in, they will influence. We don't think that's as simplistic as that. We think Saudi actually uses curriculum, actively uses the international bodies, the soft power that it has, and uses all of this to actually ensure and encourage some side of VA. It also encourages the scholarships. It also encourages in terms of how they actively groom certain people for its political spheres. We told you crucially also how the ASEAN League is important. Post-COVID, your most crucial and strongest, ally is going to be ASEAN or closer to you. We think you lose out on all of them because those countries are unwilling to support radical Islamism. We think that's very, very important in this debate. Very, very proud to propose.
I thank the speaker for their fine speech and now invite the very honourable opposition whip to give their speech not exceeding 7 minutes in length. Hear, hear.
Am I audible?
Yes.
All right. Just give me a few seconds. Let me wrap my notes up. Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. I think the entire Gulf bench actually puts an overarching importance on how Saudi Arabia will suddenly get all the leverage in the world over ASEAN countries because of some education investments, right? They never give you structural reasons as to why we should believe so, or they never draw the comparative as to what prior other relations they have to not do so as an incentive, right? Because let me tell you, and this is an important clarification before we move on to anything, right? Already the ASEAN Muslim majority countries and Saudi Arabian economy is interlinked to a point where the harms that they talk about can already exist in this current world, right? Meaning that just look at the amount of economic ties they have, look at the amount, look at the context. The Saudi oil prices are dropping every now and then, right? So Saudi Arabia has an active incentive to diversify the trade. Their most potential partners are the ASEAN nations. Hence, the ASEAN nations already have some sort of a bargaining chip, but this goes two ways, right? But secondarily, look at the labor market in Saudi Arabia filled with different ASEAN Muslim majority migrant workers, right? Because of COVID, a lot of migrant workers that usually come from India or Bangladesh cannot come into Saudi Arabia. So their options are then limited to these countries like Malaysia or Indonesia and stuff like that. At that very point, Saudi Arabia already has interlinked ties and trading ties with these ASEAN nations to say that firstly, these ASEAN nations do have some sort of a bargaining chip, but even under their best case scenario, if I am to consider that they do not have any bargaining chip, if we say that Saudi Arabia have all the bargaining chip, then they already do have that bargaining chip. These education investments don't increase the bargaining chip to the point or the extent the entire government would like to prove. If I was to believe otherwise, they needed to give me structural reasons as to why I should believe so, right? Then a few important things that the whip tries to bring on, right? The whip suddenly draws on logical leaps as to how suddenly there will be political fighting, right? And how your only way to survive in the economy is through ASEAN cooperation, right? Look at the political fighting that they talk about or the conflict that they talk about, right? They never tell you reasons as to why some poor neighborhood in Malaysia or Indonesia, when they, in this dire time of COVID, when they would not have gotten any funding from anywhere else, given the context that all the other countries are broke as fuck, that under that context would suddenly, through the inception of education, turn the entire political sphere of Malaysia upside down, right? They never give you that reason. Wafi, on the other hand, draws the comparative as to how the problems under our side are far worse. But even if I'm to talk about their the only thing exclusively coming out of closing government, that is that look, you need to be with ASEAN to maintain economic policies. The motion never states that you accepting Saudi funding in education actually means you cutting off ties with other ASEAN nations in terms of trade. Given the fact that every single country in this like situation under the context of COVID is already facing some sort of financial burden, I don't think other ASEAN nations are at a state or at a place where they can sever trading ties between each others, right? But even if I'm to consider the best case scenario, you always need to bring in the context that if you have Saudi as an ally, you essentially have the highest like the commercial hubs as your allies as well, given that this also opens avenues into like investments in USA and other Western blocs, right? So important thing. So now the closing government is out of the debate. Let's talk about opening government and most government material in general, right? Understand that they always talk about, right, their entire case is hinged upon, oh look, Wahhabism is bad and how it will do a lot of bad, right? Understand that they never give you reasons as to why we should believe that this Wahhabism is bad, is far worse than the current problems that these ASEAN nations are facing. WASI gives you context as to how bad the unemployment situation is, how there is an overarching need for employment at this time, right? So even at the cost of some sort of like Wahhabi principles being preached under the context of education, would much rather have a world where in this dire economic time, we do not give up, we do not send off investments, or we do not say no to investments because we clearly need them, right? But secondarily, understand that if you do not accept these investments, we've already proven to you that Saudi and these countries have enough interlink to already have some sort of like backroom Wahhabism entering into like Malaysia or Indonesia, right? Why is that so? Understand that these countries already Saudi Arabia historically have always funded smaller groups or like radical smaller groups as long as they fit the agenda. So if the agenda is to spread Wahhabism, they can already do that. But given the fact that these investments would come through government, we have more bargaining chip, we have more accountability, and we have more monitoring capital than their other house, right? Understand. Then another important thing to push in this debate, right? Understand that Saudi funding, even without Saudi funding, there are some harmful problems that still exist. Like understand about the low literacy rate, unemployment, and the lack of trading options. Why is this the most important thing in this debate, right? Understand that all of these cannot be solved unless you take Saudi funding, like we've mentioned before, as to them the only one capable of doing so. But secondarily, if these problems are not solved with Saudi funding, all the problem that GovBench talks about gets far worse. Understand, it is easier to proselytize or to brainwash a nation that is not educated or that is not enlightened, that is on the brink of a huge economic crisis, right? So meaning to say that if your arguments are, one, there will be higher political conflict, two, that Wahhabism is a bad concept and that like people will get somehow influenced by it, it's far worse on your side, because as soon as you do not receive any funding, your entire country goes into far worse turmoil. Under that context, all the harms that they talk about get heightened to much higher degrees, right? Now, it is important to understand in this debate that the COVID crisis is the most important frame in this debate, given that the entire ideas given by the entire government overlook the fact that the countries are currently facing some sort of economic turmoil, right? Under that context is the most important context that needs to be taken. Why are we above OG? OG never takes the burden of actually engaging the GovBench, but even if they do it under the niche concept of only Indonesia. We are the only house in this debate that engages in all front. We are the only house in this debate that actually debates under the context of Muslim majority countries. Extremely proud to.
I thank the speaker for their fine speech and thank everyone for that debate. I now ask the judging panel to move on to the judge deliberations or voice server on Discord. And good luck.